Is it the source from which everything springs, or the horizon to strive for? Hello from Fabio Fiorentini. Welcome to Blockchain for Healthcare. Today's episode is dedicated to decentralization, and the next episode, which will instead be dedicated to the application of decentralization to the healthcare system, are, in my opinion, crucial episodes for understanding what it means to use a decentralized project applied to a specific context. You've surely noticed that I mention the word decentralization much more often than blockchain, or possibly DLT. That is distributed ledger technology. There's a reason behind this, and that is why. Because blockchain and DLT are technologies, and technology is a means. A means to do what? To achieve an end, a specific end, which is precisely decentralization. In this case, we're talking about data, but it can then be extended to other fields as well. Let me clarify for everyone who isn't familiar with these kinds of technologies and may not even know the terminology very well. This is obviously a very rough generalization, but is just to convey some basic concepts, also because, as I've already said, the degree of decentralization changes depending on the type of technology used. There are two schools of thought which are antithetical to each other. Both agree that blockchain is a subset of DLT, distributed ledger technology. Where they disagree, however, is that one school claims that DLTs are themselves a subset of the larger set of databases, distributed ones, which of course are themselves a subset of databases. The other school of thought, on the other hand, says that DLTs are not databases. In any case, let's leave these speculations to the experts. In short, a blockchain is a transaction ledger where new data can be recorded, but existing entries cannot be modified. This mechanism is called add-on, meaning you can only add. It has a block structure, like the pages of a ledger, each of which contains the fingerprint of the previous page. If a page were modified, its fingerprint would also change, altering the next page, and so on for all the following ones. In this way, it is not possible to alter any page of the ledger without modifying all the subsequent ones. If making changes is made sufficiently difficult, after just a few pages you would have a ledger that is effectively unalterable. You should know that the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains are public, permissionless blockchains. Then over time, there was a change. There are permissioned ones, there are private ones. But let's leave that aside for now, because it's a world that doesn't concern us at the moment. We might come back to it if it becomes useful, but for now, let's leave it. Consider that there are databases, distributed databases, DLTs, blockchains, and that's where we'll stop. When we talk about decentralization here, we are mainly referring to the decentralization of health data. Today we are going to look at where the concept of decentralization originates and how it has evolved over time. In the next episode, instead, we will address the relationship between decentralization and the hacker ecosystem. To explain the concept of decentralization, I will refer to a segment from a video that appeared about a year ago on the technical channel Blockchain Cafe, which is the channel I usually use to keep myself updated on blockchain technology. It's run by the excellent Marco Crota, who is a very clear expert when it comes to explaining things. And in this video, it was explained how the concept of decentralization was born and what it referred to at that time. In fact, this concept originated back in 1964 from the studies of Paul Baran and referred to communication networks in a pre-internet era. At that time, people were imagining something that over the years eventually evolved into the actual internet. These networks could be of three types. The first type is a centralized network, where there is a main node and everything else around it. The secondary elements. The second type is a decentralized network, where we have a series of main nodes, or hubs, each of which has secondary elements around it, which we can call spokes. If a hub were to be eliminated, all the spokes connected to it would automatically be eliminated as well, while the rest of the network would continue to function unchanged. The third type is distributed. There are no longer hubs, that is main nodes, but instead a series of nodes connected to each other in various ways, so that if one node were to be eliminated, the network of connections would continue to function unchanged. An example of this type is peer-to-peer networks. Therefore, the transition goes from a centralized system to a decentralized one and then to a distributed one. It can also be described as a kind of evolutionary path in which its resilience increases. With the birth of Bitcoin and blockchain in the early days of 2009, the concept of decentralization, borrowed from Baran's studies on communication networks, was transformed by also incorporating the concept of distribution and extending itself to other fields. Socio-political, economic, and financial as a way to overcome a central authority. There was a shift from a network topology to a goal, and at the same time to the means of achieving it. This happened gradually as blockchain and DLT technology led to the creation of projects tailored to these specific fields. The most immediate example is the so-called DeFi, decentralized finance, which, however, we are not dealing with here, or the more recent DeSci, decentralized science. We will see with this channel whether the application of blockchain and DLT technology to the healthcare ecosystem will actually lead to the birth, or has already led to the birth, of the decentralized healthcare. But why does this new concept of decentralization develop specifically with blockchain and Bitcoin? Because the functions of money are perhaps the most difficult thing to reproduce in a decentralized system. And Bitcoin was created precisely with that goal in mind. Only time will tell whether it will succeed or not. Decentralization, therefore, can be both an attribute of a system and the method by which that attribute is achieved, that is, the process required to obtain it. At this point, let's examine the new concept of decentralization and compare it with centralization. In a decentralized system, and perhaps even a distributed one, control shifts from a few controllers to all users. And this allows it to be a much more powerful engine of innovation than a centralized system, as it becomes much more difficult to protect established interests without further merit. The dynamics of control management, which shifts from a few controllers to all users. This is what happens in a decentralized system. This is what happens in the open source world. By the way, thank you, open source. It doesn't mean free of charge, but rather readable and verifiable by anyone. There's a counterintuitive concept about open source that's important to explain. Generally, we tend to consider things under our control as more valuable. But when decentralized platforms are designed, the paradigm is reversed, and what we lose control over becomes more powerful and therefore more valuable. This happens precisely because control shifts from a small group to all users. So, to return to the question at the beginning of the video, decentralization, rather than the source from which everything originates, is the horizon to strive for. But be careful, this is not a dogma, meaning that decentralization isn't always the right solution. Always, everywhere, and in any case, and maybe even for everyone. Absolutely not. Let me give you an example. There are cases where centralization is appropriate. I'm referring, for instance, to the procurement of goods and services, where it's better to have centralization in a contracting authority, because it leads to greater effectiveness and efficiency. So when is decentralization needed? To answer this question, I'll borrow from Sergio De Prisco, architect of the decentralized platform Seed Venture, his definition of the necessary and sufficient condition for decentralization to be appropriate. I heard it at a conference and immediately made it my own because it seemed perfect to me. The coexistence of a plurality of actors with different organizations and divergent interests who need to share data in the absence of a central authority that certifies its integrity. In short, decentralizing fundamentally means disintermediating. In the next video, we'll discuss the impact that decentralization is already having on the health ecosystem and on healthcare. So if you're interested in these topics, subscribe to Blockchain. Goodbye.